Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. We left off last time with the death of Maria Theresa and the beginning of the sole reign of her son, Emperor Joseph II. We discussed how Maria Theresa was responsible for important changes in the way that Austria operated, including changes to the military and the educational system. However, the brunt of the substantial changes that marked the advent of liberalism in the Habsburg monarchy were undertaken under Joseph II, giving the name Josephinism to the slate of reforms in Austria associated with enlightened absolutism. One innovation adopted by Joseph was cameralism. In the 33rd annual Robert A. Kahn Memorial Lecture, which is a big deal for people who study the history of Austria, the historian Franz Szabó identified cameralism as the primary political ideology underlying Joseph's reforms. According to Szabó, cameralism, quote, generally addressed practical problems of state building and posited policy recommendations to improve resource management and the productivity and moral well-being of society, end quote. Further, Szabó said that cameralism took a peculiar form in the Habsburg monarchy. In other parts of Europe, cameralism was strongly identified with a mercantilist political economy. This sort of economy viewed protection of the national economy as the highest priority for the national government and viewed trade with other countries as a zero-sum game, that is, a game in which only one side can win, while the other must lose. As a result, mercantilism in practice focused on policies such as high tariffs to prevent the influx of foreign goods. Under the influence of Wenzel Anton, Prince of Kaunitz-Rietberg, who was state chancellor from 1753 to 1792, the Austrian economy was increasingly influenced by the anti-cameralist positions of the Enlightenment in Western Europe, which emphasized free trade. Unlike mercantilism, free trade was and is a philosophy characterized by the embracing of open borders for the international trade of goods. Instead of protection via tariffs and trade disputes regularly settled by war, this new direction in political economy was intended to provide fiscal support to the increasingly centralized state. This centralization was occurring not only in Central Europe, but in Western Europe as well. However, this project did require some tweaking. Kaunitz's initial centralizing impulse was embodied in the Directorium, which was established in the 1750s as a sort of super-ministry. However, the Directorium did not last long, and it ultimately gave way in the subsequent decade to multiple autonomous government ministries. In addition, a Staatsrat, or State Council, was established to communicate with the Archduke the opinions of these competing ministries. Szabó's most interesting point in the Kahn Memorial Lecture is his inclusion of Jansenism among the forces pushing the Habsburg monarchy toward reform. Jansenism was a Catholic movement heavily influenced by the emphasis in Calvinism on predestination, sin, and grace. Under the influence of Jansenism, reformers sought to bring the Catholic Church even further under state control. The result of the power of the Church being brought under the thumb of the state was that, quote, secular, rational, and utilitarian values and a simpler internalized religious ethos thus came to constitute the backbone of Josephinism, end quote. Thus, militant Catholicism gave way to a softer ecumenism. Within this context, Joseph promulgated twin reforms: the Tolerance Patent of 1781, which provided religious freedom to Lutherans, Calvinists, and Orthodox Christians living under the Habsburg monarchy, and the Tolerance Edict of 1782, which extended these protections to Jews as well. These statutes were logical outcomes of the emperor's position that, in its demands on the church, the state ought to take the maximalist position because the complaints that it was bound to receive would be the same whether the demands were moderate or extreme. We should take a moment to fully appreciate how forward-thinking this kind of religious tolerance was in the late 18th century. Certainly Americans are accustomed to thinking that their country was founded in a spirit of religious tolerance, and of course this belief is generally true. However, few other countries in the 1780s had taken as liberal a viewpoint as Austria or the United States. The British had solved their religious quarrels with the so-called Glorious Revolution of the 1680s, but Catholics remained largely restricted in their rights for many years thereafter. Yes, Benjamin Disraeli, a man of Jewish ancestry, was the British Prime Minister in the 19th century, but he was also a convert to Christianity. Otherwise, he would not have been able to hold such a position. In truth, Jews were not fully equal members of society in Austria either, although many pre-existing restrictions were lifted under Joseph II. Jews were now entitled to send their children to the Austrian schools that they so wished, as well as to hire Christian employees at their businesses. It is not an overstatement to declare that Jews were among the most prominent recipients of the benefits of the Enlightenment belief in the innate equality of all human beings and their having the same rights. We should also consider the extent to which the changes that had taken place during the reign of Joseph's mother, Maria Theresa, had influenced Joseph's decision to issue his tolerance declarations. In the 1770s, when Maria Theresa was still alive and reigning with her son as co-ruler, the Archduchess had participated in the first partition of Poland, as we discussed in the previous episode. This partition came as the result of the loss by Poland in a war against Russia. Along with Russia, Prussia and Austria each took a share of Polish territory. Prussia took territory adjacent to the city of Danzig, an important port on the Baltic Sea, and in doing so it linked its territory via land to its former exclave of East Prussia. Russia annexed territory in what today is mainly parts of Ukraine and Belarus. Finally, as we discussed last episode, Austria took the territory called Galicia. Galicia added a large population to Austria that it had not previously had within its borders. The two largest of these groups were Poles and Ruthenians, the latter of whom we today call Ukrainians. Having had a previously independent state, the Poles in Austria were not exactly happy to now be living under Austrian rule, although over time they would appreciate that Austria gave them substantially more rights than either Russia or Prussia did. The Ukrainians were, in the late 18th century, a mainly rural population in the eastern part of Galicia. They had long battled against Polish landlords and the Polish nobility, and although their ascendance to the formal political structures of Austria would take more time than that of other peoples, Ukrainians would experience a full-fledged national awakening before the fall of Austria-Hungary in 1918. Most importantly to Emperor Joseph's tolerance, Maria Theresa brought under Habsburg rule literally hundreds of thousands more Jews than before. Before the Polish partition, most Jews in Austria lived in or near Vienna, mainly under several legal restrictions. To some extent, Viennese Jews had already undergone some amount of assimilation into the larger society in which they lived. They spoke German, not Yiddish, and they had adopted the modern dress and customs of their neighbors. Many of the Jews in Galicia were very different. They spoke Yiddish rather than German, and they dressed in the black clothes that one can still see Orthodox Jews wearing in the Jewish enclaves of Brooklyn and parts of Israel. Maria Theresa was anti-Semitic, and it's likely that Joseph was as well, although perhaps not as much as his mother. Nevertheless, he understood the need for assimilation of his empire's non-German-speaking populations, which were already large and would continue to grow in size with annexations like that of Galicia. As far as the Jews of the Habsburg monarchy were concerned, Joseph knew that emancipation was the first step toward assimilation, and he was betting that his edicts would have that effect. He was not wrong. Although some Jews under Habsburg rule continued to live according to their traditional ways, speaking Yiddish and practicing Orthodox Judaism, many more became increasingly assimilated over time. They adopted German in many places as their language of everyday use. In Bohemia, many Jews adopted Czech, while in Galicia, many others adopted Polish. They also became increasingly secular or practiced more liberal forms of Judaism. Many even converted to Christianity. There is a final point to make about the emancipation of the Jews of Austria by Emperor Joseph II. For a number of reasons, among them superstition and the official teachings of the Catholic and Orthodox churches, many Austrians were anti-Semitic. The Jews' emancipation would go some way toward changing some of these Austrians' opinions about Jews. However, emancipation would also have the opposite effect among other Austrians. Emancipation meant that Jews would now play an increasingly large and visible role in Austrian society, whereas earlier regimes had kept the Jews circumscribed in their day-to-day lives, with little engagement with non-Jews. Whether for business or for pleasure, emancipation meant that the fences between Jews and Gentiles were now largely gone. Economic competition between Jews and Gentiles in the cities, for instance, would fuel a new variety of anti-Semitism that emerged in the 19th century, and that was primarily economic in nature. When this economic form of anti-Semitism fused with a later racial form, it became particularly deadly, as future episodes will discuss. I want to offer just two final notes about the annexation of Polish territory by Austria before continuing. The first is that Maria Theresa and Joseph did not acquire only Galicia in 1772. As we also discussed in the previous episode, Austria also acquired Bukovina, a separate territory to the southeast of Galicia that had not too long before been part of the Ottoman Empire. At the time that Bukovina was annexed by Austria, the majority of its population was Romanian-speaking, so the population there saw itself as related to the large Romanian-speaking population of another Austrian province, Transylvania. With Habsburg rule coming to Bukovina, the new province began to attract immigrants, first Poles and Ukrainians, and later German-speaking settlers, including large numbers of Jews. As we will see in future episodes, Bukovina would become the site of some of Austria's more innovative experiments in interethnic cooperation, as well as interethnic conflict. The second note before continuing is that, although Austria did not participate in the Second Partition of Poland in 1792, it did participate in the Third, which happened in 1795. In that final annexation of formerly Polish territory, Austria took the remainder of Galicia, including the cities of Krakow and Lublin. This annexation meant even more Polish and Jewish residents of the empire, with everything that we've already established that acquiring such populations entailed. By the time of the Third Partition, Emperor Joseph was dead and gone. He had died in February 1790 and was succeeded by his younger brother, who became the Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of Austria as Leopold II. Joseph had ruled on his own for only 10 years, but his reforms would have lasting consequences for Austria. Now, a little bit about Leopold II before we conclude this episode. Until his brother died, Leopold had been the Grand Duke of Tuscany. How was it that an Austrian Archduke came to be the Grand Duke of Tuscany, a country that today makes up part of Italy? The answer lies in the intrigues of an earlier treaty that had ended another succession war, this one in what was then Poland. Leopold's father, the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, became Grand Duke of Tuscany just after marrying Leopold's mother, Maria Theresa. After Emperor Francis died, rather than ruling Tuscany themselves, Maria Theresa and Joseph agreed that Leopold would become the next Grand Duke when Joseph died. When Leopold became Emperor and Archduke, he subsequently made his own son, Ferdinand, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. What all this meant was that the Habsburgs did not incorporate this Italian territory into their collected domains, but rather ruled it separately, likely as a condition of the treaty by which it received Tuscany in the first place. However, there were other Italian territories that the Habsburgs ruled that they would administer directly as part of Austria, but how that happened is a story for another episode. Thanks for listening.